both administrations, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, did not recognize him as the legitimate ruler of Venezuela. Just like with Manuel Noriega, they called him the de facto ruler because he also had circumvented the proper election process and was not the legitimate ruler of Panama. So both of these cases, you got an indictment, you have an illegitimate ruler, and you have an operation that goes in to capture that person that there is an arrest warrant for. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Really, the biggest difference between Panama and Venezuela is there we went in, massive amount of troops, boots on the ground for a long time, and it took us a month to capture them. Here, we were in there for an hour. And Venezuela has a much, much more robust, defense system than Panama did. And so I think really, legally they're exactly the same, but tactically, this Pentagon did a far superior job.
All right, guys, good Tuesday to you. We are into 2026, like you read about. President Trump briefing House Republicans today on the agenda for 2026 as we head into the midterms. A lot to get to with lawyer Tim Parlatore, Navy JAG officer, part of all sorts of things that are going down with Venezuela. He's going to give us the legal justification plus the legal justification for birthright citizenship. The back and forth between Shawn Ryan, the podcaster, and Dan Crenshaw. So much to get into. We're going to just jump right into it now. But before I do that, guys, I'm telling you, I told you before, every time I snack now, my go-to is masa. I love these tortilla chips. They are absolutely amazing. I brought them with me on vacation. I brought them out for the family. Everybody loved them during the Christmas break. It is unbelievable. You want to upgrade your snacks to these things. 3 ingredients in masa chips. 100% grass-fed beef tallow, sea salt, and corn. That's it. Maha approved. No bloating. It is unbelievable. No seed oils, no crashing. Unbelievable. These are the original. I love the Cabanero. Unbelievable flavors. There's a lime one that I can't get enough of. That's why I highly recommend that you start with the variety pack and either the masa chips or the Vandy crisps. Those are the potato chip version, which are the best that I've ever had in my life. Smokehouse barbecue, definitely a try. That's my pro tip. Get the variety pack in either masachips.com/Shawn or vandycrisp.com/Shawn. Use code word Shawn in both cases to get 25% off or scan the QR code to claim this delicious offer. And by the way, if you're out one of those Sprouts supermarkets, you can get them right now. But go to masachips.com/Shawn or vandycrisp.com/Shawn. Use code word Shawn for 25% off. Without further ado, so much to break down with lawyer extraordinaire Tim Parlatore. Tim, welcome back to the show. It seems like I never can get enough. Every time I turn around, there's another issue that I need to get some strong legal insight on, and we have a lot today to talk about. Venezuela, Dan Crenshaw and Shawn Ryan. There's a whole nother Navy SEAL issue that I know you're involved with Rob O'Neill. So sit back, folks, because we're going to literally get a billable hour out of Tim Parlatore here. Let's start with Venezuela, because last night the Hill got briefed, and it was almost like there was a briefing and people came out thinking there were two different sides to it. The Republicans came out and made it very clear this wasn't an act of war. We are not going into Venezuela with boots on the ground. It was a capture operation. And then the Democrats came out, and one Politico read says Democrats say Trump started a war that will have dire and perhaps widespread outcomes. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said that they did not receive any assurances that we'd not try to do the same thing in other countries. But before we get to the other countries piece, let's just focus on Venezuela.
Sure.
Is there any legal question that we had the authority to go in and capture Maduro?
Legally, there's not a question. I mean, this is something that's been done before. There is strong precedent for it. We did it in Panama with Manuel Noriega back in the late 80s. This is something that, he was indicted back in 2020. Both administrations, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, they both had that indictment, standing there. Both administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, did not recognize him as the legitimate ruler of Venezuela. Just like with Manuel Noriega, they called him the de facto ruler because he also had circumvented the proper election process and was not the legitimate ruler of Panama. So both of these cases, you got an indictment, you have an illegitimate ruler, and you have an operation that goes in to capture that person that there is an arrest warrant for. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Really, the biggest difference between Panama and Venezuela is there we went in, massive amount of troops, boots on the ground for a long time, and it took us a month to capture them. Here, we were in there for an hour. And Venezuela has a much, much more robust, defense system than Panama did. And so I think really, legally they're exactly the same, but tactically, this Pentagon did a far superior job.
Yeah, I as I've said in the last couple of days, I think war colleges, whether it's the Navy War College in Newport or the Army College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, I think are going to be studying the precision and the execution of this operation for decades, if not centuries. It was flawless, and I'm blown away by how well it was executed, how complicated it was. It didn't leak out, how prepared. I mean, when you heard Chairman Dan Kane talk about the level of preparedness and planning that went into this, just taking off your legal hat and put back on your sort of naval hat. Like, to me, this was like, I just kept going, holy smokes. It wasn't like a SEAL team went in, grabbed a guy and snatched him, got out, or the Delta guys went in and did it. This was multi-pronged, joint involved kind of an operation.
This is far more complicated than the Bin Laden raid, because here, you're not just, going in and getting one guy in this building that is somewhat defended. You're going in and grabbing a guy on a military base with significant, billion-dollar Russian air defense system. And we use so many different assets. And really, one of the side stories that people aren't really talking about as much, this is going to decimate the Russian arms sales because they've been selling these anti-aircraft, weapons to all these different countries. I think Venezuela, they sold them over $1 billion. Not a single missile got off the rails.
And that's, again, before we get back into the legal thing, I was thinking of this. Like, you look at the the Biden botched Afghanistan withdrawal and like what the signal it sent to the world. And then I thought about this signal, and this signal, I was like, if I were another foreign leader, I'd be like, holy smokes,
right?
They can do that. And we basically revealed very overtly, yeah, we can do this. And so the question I have for you isn't so much what we can do, but what you just touched on. Doesn't this reveal the weakness of like the Russian defenses?
Yeah, it does. I think it's not only going to cause a whole bunch of countries to realize that the defense system they've spent billions of dollars on is worthless. It's also, I think it's going to end up over the next few years really hurting the Russian economy because one of their big exports is these weapon systems. And now, I mean, their buyers are going to sit there and say, why am I going to buy that? I just saw how well it worked in Venezuela. Forget that. So, and, the Chinese, I don't know. I suspect rather that a lot of the Chinese systems are built on that same Russian technology. So I think a lot of countries probably around the world, they're sitting there saying, oops, this is a problem. And so I think that's going to help a lot of our allies because and countries that are on the fence of saying, oh, should we go with Russia or should we go with the US? I think this is going to push them in that direction, not only from the technology, but also from the aspect, and I'm getting way outside my legal hat here, but they have these deals going with the Russians and the Chinese, which we now see a deal with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative provides zero security guarantee. So
do you think, like, here's what I'm wondering. Were we prepared to take it out, their defenses, or did we know that they would fail?
My understanding, and this is, I was not involved in the operation, so I'm speaking based on publicly available information, is that the Navy Growlers were able to overcome their systems. It's a combination of, that the systems were failing because they weren't properly maintained, but also, a lot of those systems would have worked, but for, the Navy's growlers going in and, jamming them and preventing them from actually getting off the rails. So
It's funny. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago with some young naval officers who had, one of them was being asked what his specialty was going to in aviation. He said growlers, and some of the big aviators were giving him crap. And I now I think to myself, hey, that guy made a smart decision.
yeah.
Let's talk about the troops on the ground piece. And I know that that's not where we are. And part of like what I keep trying to communicate to people is everyone wants to talk about this operation in the prism of like Iraq. And they're like, okay, or even Panama. Like, okay, this is how many troops. And I'm like, what Trump has shown is that you don't have to follow that playbook.
Correct.
But let's assume for a second, because I just want to play it out. Let's assume that we do want, like, what would be the justification now? Like, the justification that I've heard is, hey, we're going in to get an indicted individual. We went in, we got him. Do we have, again, while I don't necessarily think this is going to happen, do we have the legal authority to follow on with U.S. troops?
Yeah, it really depends on a lot of things. It depends on how the Venezuelan government responds. Because if they are going to follow their own constitution and go forward to conduct, proper elections, they were initially talking about how the vice president was being somewhat cooperative with us, in which case, the authority to send in troops to assist in the orderly transfer of power and to assist in, proper elections is on consent. So there's that possibility as well. So I think that what legal justification, if troops go in, what that legal justification would be is all contingent upon what the Venezuelans do next.
Okay. When Trump talks about us controlling Venezuela, what, again, this gets back to, like, I get what we did. We went in and we said there's an indictment against this guy, Maduro. He's done bad things. A U.S. court indicted him. We went in and we got him. Okay. Easy peasy. Got it. Right. But when it comes to us saying we control Venezuela, what authority do we have to do that?
Again, that's one of those things that we're going to have to see how it plays out. I'm not sure what specific authority they're relying upon, for that statement, but I think a lot of that is going to depend on the Venezuelans. I think at the time he said that statement, there was also a belief and an understanding that the vice president was going to be cooperative and work with us. So, so that may have been what he was talking about, that we were going to be working with her to have them follow. Venezuelan constitution is different from ours. So whereas if something like that happened here, the power would immediately transfer to the vice president. Anything happens to the president, power transfers to the vice president for the remainder of the term. Under the Venezuelan constitution, it only temporarily goes to the vice president, and they have to have a special election pretty quick.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that's why this whole talk about elections is critical.
Right. Correct.
Okay.
She does not get the remainder of his term. She just is the interim leader until they can have an election, which I think is supposed to be within 30 or 90 days, something like that.
Okay, and for that obvious reason, I mean, even though I guess all this talk about Machado becoming the leader, even though, I don't know, the way I kind of looked at this is, yes, she might have won twice ago, because there was somebody in between, that you can't just put somebody in there, that in theory, like, she would still have to win again.
So, that is another possibility, and again, I don't know Venezuelan constitutional law that well, but if they were to go back and say, yes, there was fraud in the last election and she was the duly elected person, then they could, in theory, go that route. But I think what they're more likely to do is to just simply have an election at this point. And I think it would be worthwhile, whether through, the U.S., the UN, whatever, to have some international observers there to ensure that election is free from any, fraud. And then the Venezuelan people, I suspect, are going to pick somebody very different from the person that they just lost.
When it comes to the oil and the president talking about, like, U.S. oil companies, does that fall under the same bucket that you're talking about in terms of, like, the Venezuelans have a role in this too, or do we just have carte blanche into assuming control of these oil fields.
No. That again, that goes to the Venezuelan. Yeah, this is my belief. Is it goes to the Venezuelan government, and so assume that they follow their own constitution. They hold an election, and the opposition party wins. So now you have a new Venezuelan president that's very friendly to us, and decides, you know what, we're going to start exporting and we're going to start doing trade with the U.S. instead of just with China and Russia. That's, I think, really what it is.
Okay. One of the big talking points, as I mentioned, from the Democrats, and frankly, the White House isn't doing much to tamp it down, is where do we go next? So I want to group this into two buckets. Yeah. The first bucket is sort of the Colombia, Cuba, Mexico bucket, and then I want to talk separately about Greenland. So let's start with those three countries.
Sure.
The president, the secretary of state have talked about, like, are we just in theory saying, hey, you guys might just fall now? Or is there, do you see any sense that, like, hey, we have a legal justification to go into any of those first three countries?
It's difficult to really know that. One of the things that President Trump does so well is by not letting everybody know what he's going to do. This was a complete surprise when he did this. And so, is there a legal justification for those other countries? Maybe. But it's not the kind of thing that he's going to talk about. I mean, you remember back in 2002, 2003, where we talked repeatedly for months about taking out Saddam Hussein before the first troops went into Iraq. President Trump is very different from that, so he's not going to really telegraph. And so I think that even if there are certain countries where there's no legal justification, there's no reason for him to simply come out and say, hey, President of Cuba, you're safe. Don't worry about it. Better for him to say, look, we will go where we go. We'll see what happens. And so even if those presidents are completely safe from this type of operation, there's no reason to tell them that.
Right.
Of course, if next week we see Pam Bondi go into the Southern District of New York and get an indictment against the Ayatollah, that might be somewhat of a telegraphing, Yeah.
Well, we were telegraphed. Stephen Miller was on with Jake Tapper last night, made it very clear that the position of the United States is that we should have control of Greenland. So I do put this in a separate bucket because we are being very clear that it is, quote, according to him, the position of the U.S. government that we should control Greenland. Now, I argue, Tim, that this is a little bit of posturing. Maybe the president saying, I control Greenland, with them kind of countering. Maybe you can have a greater military presence and have access to our rare earth minerals. Like, is this Trump negotiating, or is this a smart legal strategy?
I suspect it's a negotiation. I mean, one thing that people have to remember, and I'm not involved in the policy end of things at all. I'm a lawyer, and I do some work with the Department of Defense or Department of War, but the Pentagon does not set international policy. The Pentagon exists for one purpose and one purpose only: to give the president and the Secretary of State options, to give them options so that they have negotiating room to do what they really need to do. And so, does the Pentagon really intend to invade Panama? No. But do they have a plan to invade Panama so that gives the president the negotiating space to negotiate a better deal on Panama Canal access? Of course. Are they going to invade Greenland? Probably not. But do they have a plan to? Absolutely. They have a plan for everything. And all these plans, what they specifically would be is of course classified, but do they probably have a plan of how to invade France? I would expect so. They have plans for everything. So whether those plans are things we're actually going to dust off and use, hell, they probably have plans there of how are we going to respond, to an alien invasion. What would we do if the Confederacy, rise out of the graves and, comes at us with zombies? They probably have, response plans for all of that, whether it's realistic or not. So,
I want to go back to the legal justification, though. I get the Venezuelan one. To me, is actually kind of easy. Like, there was an indictment of a bad person. Okay. By the way, can I just ask this, like, as an individual, like, I've always heard so-and-so gets indicted by a U.S. court or something and flees to wherever. Right. Okay. So normally there's an extradition process, right?
Right.
I get that the guy's the leader and he wouldn't have extradited himself, but just play this out for me for 1 second. Like, let's say that you or I were indicted by a U.S. court and we went to Panama,
Right.
or to Venezuela. Wouldn't we go to their government and say, "Can you extradite Tim or Shawn and bring them back or help us?" But like, why was it like what I found fascinating about this case? Because if you're Noriega, you saw him in court yesterday saying, "Hey, I am the leader. I mean, what did he say? Like, I'm a good guy." Like, but I was like, is that going to be his case where he says, "Hey, judge, like, you guys didn't have the jurisdiction to come get me. I'm in my own country."
I think he will definitely try it, and he will fail because Manuel Noriega already litigated that. And so there is settled case law on that. So, so that's a losing argument, for him. Extraditions are based on treaties. And so, we do not have, I don't believe, a treaty that includes an extradition provision with Venezuela. And so when you see people that, get indicted and run away and they go to, Cyprus or, various countries that don't have an extradition treaty, Snowden goes to Russia. Why do you think he went to Russia? Because they're not going to extradite him. So it's based on treaties, and there is a sophisticated process. I've dealt with it. Even just trying to extradite somebody, I was actually on the other side trying to prevent them from extraditing somebody from Australia, one of our closest allies, and you still have to go through an entire process of, showing the legitimacy of the indictment and showing that the crime in the U.S. has a parallel crime in Australia and everything else. I once fought an extradition where they were trying to pull a U.S. soldier into Italy, to be tried in an Italian court, and what they had charged him with was not a crime in the U.S., and so we refused to extradite him to Italy. So there is a sophisticated process there for the countries that we're very friendly with, that we have a treaty with. That doesn't exist with Venezuela. So
let's just say for fun that Maduro, the judge, rules in his favor and says, whatever. Does he just get to go home? Like, let's just, I mean, I'm trying to figure this. I was thinking about this. Like, somebody asked me, what happens if he is found not guilty for whatever reason? What happens?
That's a good question. If he is ultimately found not guilty, then we have no reason to hold him. And so he would be released. Of course, he, at that point, doesn't have any immigration status in this country, so he would be deported back to his country of origin, unless another country were to come in and ask us to extradite him to them first.
Interesting. Because that's kind of what happened with Noriega, right? He got out of he served his sentence, and then we basically traded him around to other countries that wanted to indict him.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask you I think this is a weird, something that I hadn't seen when they talked about the judge. This guy is a senior judge who's 92 years old and says, "I'm going to handle the case." I didn't realize you could still, like, I don't know. We don't even allow like cardinals in the Catholic Church to serve after 70 or whatever. And I'm like, this guy's 92 and saying, "I want the case." Like, that, is that normal?
It is. So federal judges are appointed for life. And at a certain point, they are able to take senior status. And so when they take senior status, then they are off of, the regular rotation, where basically any case that comes in gets rotated around to the younger district court judges. And then once they take senior status, they can take a reduced caseload. They can pick which cases they want. They essentially get offered a case and they say, "Yes, I want it. I want that case," or they can say, "No, wheel it out to one of the younger guys that doesn't have a choice." And so that is, quite frequent. And, look, I've tried cases in front of 90-plus-year-old judges.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I guess I was kind of like, we're having this whole discussion about senility in the president with Biden. And suddenly I'm like, a 92-year-old judge. Like, I don't know. I'd be like, dude, are you going to be able to get up in the morning? And
I once appeared in front of Jack Weinstein in the Eastern District of New York. He was a submariner in World War II. He's like 98 years old, and he was still sharper than anybody else in there. Like, he would sustain an objection before the prosecutor even stood up to make the objection.
Let me ask you about the lawyer.
Yeah.
So this guy, Barry Pollock, he
Yeah.
is Julian Assange's lawyer as well. I just was intrigued, right? We pull Maduro out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's being extradited, and apparently there's actually an issue with, like, if you're a U.S. attorney, you have to like petition Treasury or something to okay. But I was like, how does that guy find an attorney? Does he go like to the internet and look for like Morgan and Morgan and be like, hey, can you guys represent me? Like, I thought that whole thing was fascinating. Like, how does Maduro go like, I need a U.S. attorney, and how does this guy Barry Pollock, does he volunteer for it? Like, do they call him and go, hey, you're representing Julian Assange, maybe you'll take this guy?
No, actually, it's a court-appointed attorney. So
no way.
Yeah, he's on the panel, the Criminal Justice Act panel, and so you have public defenders that are like full-time, federal defender's office, and then you have private attorneys that are on the CJA panel, and they get assigned to cases as well, and they're paid by the government, not the full hourly rate. I forget what it is, but it's a fraction of what they would normally get paid. And so they get assigned to these cases, and it's based on the fact that Maduro does not have an ability to pay. And which, yes, I mean, and this is kind of the funny piece, is that, forget Maduro, this is something that happens all the time, where when the government arrests somebody, they'll then seize their bank accounts, they'll seize all their assets to prevent them from having cash available to pay somebody like me. And so this is what you were talking about petitioning to Treasury and trying to get some of these funds released to pay the lawyers. And so ultimately, if he has no available funds, then legally he's indigent and therefore entitled to a public defender. So he can want whatever lawyer he wants, but if he can't pay them and if he can't get the funds to pay them, he's stuck with the public defender.
But Barry Pollock's not some random public defender, right? He is a high profile dude. Why would a guy like that want the case? Just because it's high profile?
Well, so a lot of people, they do get on this panel, and it's they can have kind of a mixed practice of some private client cases, some court appointed cases. I know a lot of people that they enjoy doing that. They feel like it's their public service, and you do get some interesting cases there. It's an ability to get a case where all you have to do is focus on representing the client without having to worry about the business of law of like, hey, can you afford this? We need to do an expert witness, but can you afford the expert or not? And we need to set the strategy based on what your individual means are. It sometimes is easier to just say, okay, well, the government's paying for it. So, if they have a forensic pathologist, then we get a forensic pathologist.
All right. I want to move to one last question before we've got so much on the agenda today. Sure. One of the theories that some of the folks on the left are making is that if we can go in and take over a country, quote unquote, like Venezuela, why can't China just say, Taiwan, you're ours? Why can't Russia just say, hey, Ukraine, you used to be part of us before you broke away, you're ours? Like, why wouldn't other countries use the justification?
Well, I think it still goes to a very individualized analysis. We are not annexing Venezuela as the 51st state.
But we would if Greenland, right?
Maybe, who knows? But that I think is the big difference. Is we're going in to take out an individual, or really two individuals that are under indictment, and so I see it to being very legally distinct from that. And because if you're taking over a country simply because you think that you have some historical cultural right to it, as opposed to some actual current controversy, that's where you do get into imperialism. And so I think that's really what it is.
I want to get to Shawn Ryan and Dan Crenshaw in a second because you're intimately involved in that. But before I do, one of the issues last time that we didn't get to, that I'm dying to hear this case, like I brought it up in the morning meeting this morning, this idea of birthright citizenship. Yeah. I, as a non-lawyer, am fascinated by this because diplomats, if you have a kid here and you're a diplomat, that kid is not a U.S. citizen because you're not subject to the laws of the United States. There's two kind of groups that I see in this argument, Tim. Mm-hmm. There are people that do come here legally
Mhm.
and then have a baby. So like you get a visa, you come to the United States, you have a baby, and that kid is in theory given U.S. citizenship. And then there are people who are here in this country illegally that have a child.
Right.
Give me the how you see this case playing out in the Supreme Court.
So it's a very interesting thing because you have to go all the way back to why was the 14th Amendment even passed? The reason why we even have this provision in the law is because after the Civil War, um, prior to the Civil War and during, citizenship was determined by the states, not the federal government. And so after the Civil War, several states refused to grant citizenship to former slaves. And so the 14th Amendment was where in addition to a whole bunch of other things, was where the federal government came in and said, no, we're taking over citizenship, and all of the freed slaves, all of these, black people are now American citizens. And they wrote it in such a way where, anybody born here, naturalized here, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Yeah, that last piece was important because the debate at the time was they didn't want it to be just anybody born here. They wanted it to be a specific, set of people born here. And so children of diplomats, as you just mentioned, children of invading forces. If the British come over here to try and fight us again, and one of their people has a child, we don't want that person to be an American citizen. And so people that are here, for those other purposes, but they still have an allegiance to a foreign government, was really kind of the thought process at the time. And the concept of legal immigration versus illegal immigration didn't really exist either at the time. And so, they passed the 14th Amendment. And then several years later, there was a dispute in California where some Chinese immigrants, who came here legally and were working on the railroads out there, they had a child, and they tried to say, well, since you're immigrants, this child is not an American citizen, it's a Chinese citizen. And so that case went up to the Supreme Court, where they held that the children of immigrants are included under the 14th Amendment. However, even though that was a hotly contested issue at the time, it was decided under the premise of it being a legal immigrant. And the concept of illegal immigration didn't really exist at the time. And so the way I look at it, it really is an issue of first impression, because everybody has just simply assumed that it applies, but no court has ever actually ruled on it or interpreted it. So which way the Supreme Court goes on it, I don't know. But what I do think is that it is a worthwhile question, to ask, because we do have a long history of debate as to what does this mean.
I agree, because to me, like I said, if we've said that certain people, i.e. diplomats, and you mentioned invading forces, don't count, then it's clear that there is a distinction about just being born here. Right. That's it. And I actually love the way you phrase this at the end, because everyone reflexively says it's like the third term for the president. Alan Dershowitz said to me the other day, it's not as simple as just no. He's like, he's got an entire book coming out on it. And all these non-lawyers like me always go, well, it says X. And it's like, well, if you go back and peel back the onion like you did and said, okay, what is the history of this amendment, this law, et cetera? And it is not as black and white. I will be interested, because the court, to me, doesn't just have a question of, are you born here or not, right? Does it retroactively address this? Right. And that's where I think there's going to be a lot of interesting look at the court. So, all right.
The thing about subject to the jurisdiction, I think that they'll probably look at that in the context of somebody comes here, and if they walk into an immigration office and they say, hi, I'm here, I'd like a visa, I want, asylum, whatever, they are subjecting themselves to that jurisdiction. But if they are sneaking across the border and they're specifically trying to avoid immigration officials, then they're not subjecting themselves to the jurisdiction thereof.
Right. And that's why that's why I broke it up by saying, hey, if you're one of these Chinese nationals that gets a visa to the United States that are pregnant and you come here, right, we might think that's shady as heck, which it is, but it's also legal.
Correct.
Yeah. The other one, sneaking over the border to have a baby, I don't see how that's even possible. But I do think that there is a way that subsequently, because once the court rules, we could write a law that says, if you're here on a visa, then, right. A tourist visa, you're not here. You might be subject to the law because, again, that's just like getting arrested here. If you get arrested here because you killed someone or you break our speeding and you came in with a visa, you're still subject to the law.
Right.
And therefore, but I think that we might need to address that in a legal way, not in a court way. Right.
Correct. Because that's the other thing. This is a hotly contested enough issue. If everybody agreed on what it should say, this would be really easy. They could just pass a constitutional amendment to clarify it.
Yeah.
There is a legislative solution here, but the reason that they're going to the court is because there is such disagreement over what it means.
Yeah. And I also think that they're politically weak and they want the court to do it. All right. I want to get to Mark Kelly before I get to Shawn Ryan, because if I don't, I'm going to get really upset with myself. All right. So Mark Kelly is one of the seditious six. He is a retired Navy captain, i.e., because he's drawing benefits, etc., still subject to a lot of the rules and regulations. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth put out a statement on X saying 6 weeks ago, Senator Mark Kelly and 5 other members of Congress released a reckless and seditious video that was clearly intended to undermine good order and military discipline. As a retired Navy captain who is still receiving military pension, Captain Kelly knows he is still accountable to military justice. Okay, walk us through what that means, because Kelly says today, I'm fighting this tooth and nail. But he is very different from like these other guys, Chris DeLuzio, among others, that serve but are not retired.
Correct. And that's the thing, is that Mark Kelly knows better, because he did do 25 years. He retired. He carries a retired ID card in his wallet, and he gets a paycheck every single month. And every military retiree knows that, that is, it is a privilege, and it is something that comes with strings attached to it. The UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, by its very nature, restricts certain rights of the people that are subject to it. But every single person that is subject to the UCMJ has voluntarily agreed contractually to abide by those terms. The UCMJ restricts your First Amendment rights. There are certain things that you cannot say if you are subject to the UCMJ versus an ordinary citizen. But when you raise your right hand, you're agreeing to do that. And that's a contract.
Okay.
You're agreeing to be subjected to court-martial, which civilians are not. And so
are you worried, though, that look, this is what I worry about. I having lived through 4 years of Biden while still serving, I worry, and I said this morning, by the way, everyone who says this is unprecedented, I don't remember a damn one of them saying anything about when Admiral Ronnie Jackson was demoted in rank under Biden. Okay. No one said a damn thing. And it wasn't until this Secretary of War and this Secretary of the Navy restored that rank, which was ridiculous. But what I do worry about is what happens when the next Democratic administration says, okay, Tim Barlatori, and frankly, you look at all these admirals and generals who, during an election season, go out and endorse and talk about why this candidate is fit or unfit. Technically, they would be breaking the UCMJ.
There's a little bit of a distinction there, and it's one of those things I think people could learn more about, to fully understand, because when you're using your rank as part of it, that certainly is problematic. When you're making clear that, hey, I'm saying this in my retired status, and this is my personal opinion, doesn't reflect the views of the Department of War or the Department of the Navy, that's fine. And so, there is an element where people are allowed to engage in political activity, not in uniform. And so as long as they keep within those rules, that's fine. What's unique about Mark Kelly is, people focus on this video, and I keep seeing, where people take this video and they then, pull clips from 2016 of Pete Hegseth saying similar things on Fox News, but they're entirely different. And I'll tell you why. Because the video itself, if all you do is look at the video, you could sit there and cut it up and say, well, yes, they are saying what the law is. But the problem is you have to look at the totality of the circumstances. if somebody puts out a video saying you have a duty to disobey unlawful orders, you don't define what those unlawful orders are. And then you separately put out a video saying, striking drug boats is unlawful. You put those two together. This is an unlawful order. You have a duty to disobey unlawful orders. If you're ordered to strike a drug boat, that's an unlawful order, and you have a duty to disobey it. You have to pull those two things together. And that's what makes it, something that's outside the bounds. The video.
Does Kelly ultimately get reduction in rank and pay?
I think he probably does. I mean, I think that, based on the facts and circumstances here, he stepped outside the lines. And, quite frankly, him right now being defiant and saying, I'm going to fight this, as opposed to just simply saying, hey, I made a mistake. I did not mean to cause confusion in the ranks. You are only supposed to disobey manifestly unlawful orders. All orders are presumed to be lawful. And just because politicians may disagree, I am not asking you, the individual service member, to disobey something just because political parties disagree. If he put that video out this afternoon, the whole thing would go away. The whole thing would end.
So if he gets, let's just say that the military determines that he has done something wrong and reduces his rank and pay. Mm-hmm. Does he have any civilian court capability? In other words, can he go outside the UCMJ and go to civilian court and argue this was a political retribution? Or does he have to contain his entire legal argument within the confines of the military justice system?
No. So there is a process. He has to go through the Board of Correction of Naval Records, and then that finding he can then appeal under the Administrative Procedure Act. You first have to exhaust all of your administrative remedies within the military system. And then, just as any other administrative decision by the executive branch, you can take that to the U.S. District Court under an Administrative Procedure Act case and litigate it there.
Okay. Tim, time is tight, but I want to get your take on Shawn Ryan, Dan Crenshaw. Let me lay the predicate. Tell me if I'm wrong, and if not. Basically, Shawn Ryan on his podcast starts talking generically about members of Congress benefiting from whatever. Doesn't mention any names.
Right.
Dan Crenshaw, congressman from Texas, former Navy SEAL, sort of sends him a message saying, hey, I'm hearing that you're talking about me, my boys in the SEALs, something to that effect. Yeah. Shawn Ryan takes offense, think that's a threat, saying my boys in the, okay. It escalates, and then somehow they resolve this to, we're going to go on the show, Shawn Ryan's podcast, and have it out. Yeah. Dan Crenshaw posts a ton of videos about this. Lo and behold, I see Tim Parlatore's name there as the lawyer representing Shawn Ryan.
That guy again.
Who knew? Who would have thought that? Give us the lay of the land in 2 minutes where this is and where it's going.
Sure. Shawn Ryan asked legitimate questions about Dan Crenshaw's accumulation of wealth. Something that Dan Crenshaw has never been willing to answer questions about. He just simply says, oh, that's been debunked. There's nothing to it. And don't ask any questions. Dan Crenshaw also has a pattern of anytime somebody says something negative about him, he'll call them up and he'll complain to them. You may get a call from him this afternoon based on this. Who knows? And then he has his lawyers send these crazy threatening letters, which most people, they just simply say, okay, I'm not going to talk about you anymore. His campaign manager actually admitted this to Shawn's producer. We send letters like this all the time, and most times that solves it and people just go away. Shawn wasn't willing to do that because it's improper. And ultimately, Dan said, okay, I'll come on your show and we'll have it out. We'll talk about it. So finally, Dan is willing to come in and answer questions about it. So we started the standard legal process. Anybody that goes on Shawn Ryan's program, they have to sign a standard form waiver. Everybody. Even President Trump, J.D. Vance, they signed this waiver. But when I sent it to Dan Crenshaw's lawyer, they redlined the hell out of it. They wanted to remove all sorts of sections out of it. They wanted to add sections to it. And you notice in Dan Crenshaw's posts, he says, "Oh, look, we agreed to everything," but he doesn't include, the attachments, because the attachments show, that they were asking for all these special accommodations. My response to them was, no, you're not getting any special accommodations. We had already made an accommodation to him. He had demanded, he was afraid that we were going to edit the program, and that, that things might be, edited down to make him look like he had said something he didn't. And so we did something that he doesn't do for any other guest, which is he agreed that it will be aired in toto, nothing pulled out, which honestly is kind of a dangerous thing, because he's had guests come on and say things that afterwards in post-production, they look at it and they say, you know what? If we let that line go out, that could cause some legal liability. And so they pull that out. If somebody comes on and is clearly defaming somebody, you try and pull it out. And, that's one of the benefits of being able to, pre-record something. And so he essentially forewent that because of Crenshaw's demands. Then Crenshaw, he wanted all these other things. And ultimately, even when I told him, look, we're not making any more edits, this is the form, he never signed it. He never signed it. And moreover, he went on other shows that same week and just went out and lied. And so if you go on a show, a couple of days before Shawn's and you say, that's all been debunked, my brokerage account has never had more than $40,000 in it. Okay, well, I got a guy that's refusing to sign the waiver form, that is demonstrating that he's continuing to lie about things, that he's not going to tell the truth. Well, then what are we doing? What's the point of having him come on? So you want to have him come on where he's not going to sign, the legal release form, and just give him an opportunity to come on and continue to lie? Yeah, and that's not Shawn. Shawn's show, he gives people the opportunity to come on and tell their stories, not the opportunity to just come on and lie to help their reelection campaign. So Shawn correctly made the decision at that point. Look, you haven't signed it. Fine. You don't get to come on. Okay. And of course, Dan went into a tailspin and tried to spin things as, oh, no. We agreed to everything here. Look at all these emails showing that we agreed to it, even though we didn't sign it. And, it's, Dan Crenshaw is a guy that when he came into Congress years ago, a lot of people had a lot of hope for him. And he has just demonstrated repeatedly that hope was misplaced. And a lot of people are very disappointed in him. He's very unpopular in the veteran community, and he's facing a very tough primary. And I think that's really what this is. This is a desperation because, he has to be worried, the voters for his primary, but also the donors. When they see him out there acting like a fool and getting into a fight with a guy like Shawn Ryan, who's going to want to donate to him knowing that he's in a major fight, with the number 2 podcaster in the country?
Yeah. All right. I know there's a lot more we could get into with this, but time is tight. So Tim, I really appreciate you breaking down all this stuff. So much more to get to. Thanks for being here as always.
All right. Thank you, Shawn.
All right, guys, thanks for joining us. Tomorrow, we've got a great show breaking down everything that President Trump said to House Republicans today. Look forward to seeing you there. Go to ShawnSpicer.com to sign up for my latest newsletter. See you tomorrow. Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.